Land grows food. Rivers bring water to crops. Mines give metals. Trade routes carry goods across continents. These simple things have shaped political authority for thousands of years. Many people think power comes from armies or laws, but in history, real authority often came from controlling resources. The ruler who controlled land, water, grain, or metal could collect taxes, pay officials, build roads, and maintain institutions that lasted across generations. This connection between resources and authority appears again and again in different civilizations. To understand political power, we need to look not only at kings or battles, but at the quieter systems of farming, mining, taxation, and administration that supported governance over time. So an important question emerges. How did control over resources shape lasting political authority, and what institutions were needed to manage that control across centuries? The earliest political authorities in human history were not built around armies in the modern sense. They were built around agriculture. When human communities shifted from hunting and gathering to settled farming, somewhere around 10,000 years ago, the nature of power shifted with them. Agricultural land became the most important productive asset in the world. Whoever controlled land controlled food supply. Whoever controlled the food supply could demand loyalty, tribute, and service. In the ancient river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, political authority and water management became deeply intertwined. Rivers flooded seasonally, depositing fertile silt across wide plains. But managing those floods, building irrigation channels, maintaining embankments, organizing labor for seasonal maintenance, required coordination that no single farming household could provide. Larger social units were needed. In time, rulers who organized irrigation labor and managed water distribution gained structural power over the communities that depended on those systems. This gave rise to what historians sometimes call hydraulic governance, authority rooted not just in military force, but in the management of water as a productive resource. Mining rights followed a similar logic. Metals were essential for tools, weapons, coins, and construction. Rulers who controlled access to silver, copper, gold, and iron mines held advantages that translated directly into wealth and state capacity. The right to mine was typically claimed by kings, emperors, and central authorities. Revenues from mining financed military campaigns, built palaces and temples, and funded the administrative staffs that kept taxation records and distributed resources. Control over mineral production was not merely economic. It was the material foundation of state power. Land systems operated in broadly similar ways. In most early agrarian societies, political authorities claimed ownership or superior rights over productive land. They did not always farm it directly. Instead, they allocated it to elites, military officers, temples, or local administrators in exchange for military service, tax payments, or administrative functions. These arrangements created incentive structures that aligned the interests of local elites with the interests of central rulers. By controlling land allocation, rulers controlled loyalty. By taxing land production, they sustained revenue streams that made governance possible. The result, across many different societies and periods, was that resource control and political authority became mutually reinforcing. Authority created the institutional capacity to manage and protect resources. Resource management created the revenue and loyalty networks that sustained authority. This circular relationship became the structural backbone of political power for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptian state offers one of the clearest examples of how resource control and political authority were institutionally integrated. Egypt's agricultural system depended entirely on the annual flooding of the Nile. The flood brought water and rich silt to farmland across the Nile Valley. Without the flood, crops failed. With it, agriculture was extraordinarily productive. The Egyptian state did not simply benefit from this natural bounty. It organized a comprehensive administrative system around it. Surveyors measured flood levels each year, predicting the likely harvest in different regions. Tax assessments were calibrated to flood measurements. A higher flood generally meant more fertile land and therefore higher expected harvests, which supported higher tax demands. Grain collected as tax filled state warehouses. From those warehouses, the state paid workers on major construction projects, funded temple establishments, supplied military campaigns, and maintained the administrative apparatus itself. The pharaoh was both political ruler and ceremonial manager of the Nile's bounty. Authority was not simply declared as divine. It was organized around the management and redistribution of agricultural resources on an enormous scale. This administrative dependency had important structural consequences. The Egyptian state required sophisticated record-keeping to track land holdings, flood measurements, tax assessments, and grain stocks. It required trained scribes, regional administrators, and inspection systems. The larger the resource base it managed, the more complex the administration it needed. Resource control strengthened authority, but it also created a deep dependency on institutional capacity. When the administrative systems weakened, when records were poorly kept or officials became corrupt, the resource base became harder to manage and tax. Authority became more fragile precisely because it was so structurally dependent on the systems that maintained resource control. The Roman Empire approached land taxation with comparable institutional seriousness. Roman provincial governance was fundamentally a system for extracting tax revenue from agricultural land across an enormous territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. The census was the foundational tool. Regular censuses documented population, landholdings, and productive capacity across Roman provinces. From census data, administrators calculated tax obligations. Land taxes, collected in cash or grain depending on the region and period, were the primary revenue source for the Roman state. They funded the legions, paid the administrative salaries, and financed the infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, harbors, that in turn made taxation and commerce more efficient. The Roman system required sophisticated bureaucratic infrastructure to function at scale. Provincial governors, procurators, tax collectors, and local administrators formed a layered administrative network. The system was not perfectly efficient or free from corruption, but its structural depth gave it remarkable durability. Even as the empire faced military and political challenges, the tax and land administration systems continued to function across much of the territory. What historians sometimes call the institutional memory of Roman administration, the legal frameworks, the survey records, the administrative procedures, persisted even through periods of political instability. This illustrates a key insight. Resource control strengthens authority, but the deeper the administrative dependency, the more vulnerable the system becomes when institutional capacity erodes. The Ottoman timur system, developed from the 14th century onward, represents a different institutional solution to the same fundamental problem. The Ottoman Empire governed vast territories across the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe. Centrally administering taxation across such diverse regions was practically difficult. The timur system offered a decentralized alternative. Productive agricultural land was organized into revenue units called timurs. These land grants were assigned to cavalry soldiers called sipahis, who were entitled to collect tax revenues from the local agricultural population in exchange for military service when called upon by the Sultan. The system was elegant in its incentive design. The sipahi had a direct financial stake in maintaining agricultural productivity on his timur because his income depended on it. He was expected to maintain order, protect the farming population, and ensure that fields remained productive. The Ottoman central government, in turn, did not need to maintain a large salaried tax-collecting bureaucracy in every rural province. The military administrative function was fused at the local level through resource allocation. Timurs were not hereditary property but conditional grants, revocable by the Sultan, which kept sipahis dependent on imperial favor rather than autonomous. By structuring land revenue rights as conditional grants tied to military service, the Ottoman state created a loyalty mechanism through resource control rather than through direct payment or force alone. The early modern European crown monopolies operated on related principles, though in commercial rather than purely agricultural settings. European monarchies increasingly claimed exclusive rights over specific productive resources and commercial activities: salt production, silver mining, tobacco, the spice trade. The Portuguese and Spanish crowns in the 15th and 16th centuries asserted monopoly control over Atlantic and Indian Ocean trade routes, treating them as state-owned commercial assets rather than open commons. The revenues generated by these monopolies funded royal courts, military campaigns, colonial administration, and debt service to European banking houses. The institutional logic was consistent with older patterns of resource control. By concentrating rights over productive assets, rulers generated revenue streams that sustained political authority and funded the instruments of governance. What varied across these examples was the specific form of resource and the institutional mechanism for managing it. What remained constant was the structural relationship. Organized control over productive resources created the revenue and loyalty foundations that sustained political authority over time. Looking across these historical examples, several structural patterns become clear. The first and most consistent is that revenue supports authority. This may seem obvious, but it is worth examining carefully. Political authority is expensive to maintain. Armies require pay, equipment, and supply. Administrative staffs require salaries. Infrastructure requires construction and maintenance. Legal systems require courts and officials. In the absence of reliable revenue, these functions cannot be sustained. Rulers who controlled productive resources and built systems to extract revenue from them could maintain the institutional apparatus of governance across generations. Rulers who did not face chronic fiscal instability, which typically translated into administrative weakness, military vulnerability, and political fragility. The second recurring pattern concerns how rulers and local elites shared incentives around resource control. Pure centralization was rarely achievable or sustainable in large pre-modern empires. The distances involved, the limitations of communication, and the complexity of local conditions meant that rulers almost always relied on local intermediaries, provincial governors, military officers, noble landholders, temple administrators, regional merchants, to collect taxes, manage land, and enforce authority at the local level. These intermediaries received a share of the resources in exchange for their administrative and military services. The result was a layered system in which resource control was not simply centralized, but distributed through networks of shared incentives. Local elites had strong reasons to support and cooperate with central authority because their own income and status depended on the resource allocation systems that central authority maintained and legitimized. This shared incentive structure was a source of stability, but it also introduced tensions. Local administrators with control over productive resources could accumulate enough wealth and military capacity to challenge central authority. Rulers spent considerable institutional energy designing systems to limit this risk, rotating officials regularly so they did not develop deep local roots, requiring regular audits and inspections to monitor resource flows, designing conditional rather than hereditary resource grants, and maintaining the legal fiction that all productive land ultimately belonged to the crown or the state. The Timur system's insistence on revocable rather than hereditary grants was one expression of this concern. The third structural pattern is the tension between centralization and local autonomy. Effective resource extraction required some degree of local knowledge and administrative capacity, but extensive local autonomy threatened central revenue flows and created risks of fragmentation. Different empires navigated this tension differently. Some invested heavily in trained central bureaucracies. The Chinese imperial examination system was partly designed to produce a standardized, ideologically aligned administrative class capable of managing resource systems across diverse regions. Others, like the Ottomans with their Timur system, created decentralized structures with institutional safeguards against full autonomy. None solved the tension permanently. Administrative systems that worked well under strong central leadership often weakened during periods of succession crises, military pressure, or rapid territorial expansion. The structural insight is that managing this tension was itself a core function of governance, not a problem to be solved once, but an ongoing institutional challenge. These patterns of resource control and political authority did not disappear as the world moved into more recent centuries. They persisted in adapted forms as economies and governance systems changed. The mercantilist states of 17th and 18th century Europe maintained the essential logic of resource control, though the resources in question increasingly included colonial trade revenues, manufactured goods, and financial systems rather than simply agricultural land. European crowns competed intensely for control of silver and gold mines in the Americas, for monopoly rights over lucrative spice and textile trades, and for the revenue-generating capacity of colonial plantation systems. The institutional mechanisms were different: chartered trading companies, colonial fiscal administrations, mercantilist trade regulations, but the structural logic was the same. Resource control sustained the revenue flows that funded military capacity and administrative governance. The development of formalized land registries in the 18th and 19th centuries across Europe and colonial territories represented a significant institutional evolution. Accurate land surveys and formal title registration systems gave states unprecedented information about productive assets within their territories. This information capacity made taxation more systematic, more comprehensive, and more resistant to evasion. The administrative investment in these registry systems reflected a well-established historical understanding that knowing what resources existed where they were and who controlled them was the foundational step in building reliable revenue systems and therefore durable political authority. The expansion of natural resource extraction in the 19th century, coal, iron, petroleum, continued to follow similar institutional patterns. States that developed effective legal and administrative frameworks for managing mineral rights, collecting royalties, and directing resource revenues into public finances built institutional capacity that translated into governance durability. Where those frameworks were weak or absent, resource wealth often generated instability rather than strength, as competing interests fought over allocation without the institutional structure needed to manage distribution sustainably. What the history of resource control and political authority shows, across many different civilizations and centuries, is that authority is not simply a matter of military force or legal declaration. It is the product of organized systems. Rulers who built institutions capable of managing land, water, minerals, and trade, who developed the administrative capacity to tax production reliably, to allocate resources in ways that aligned local interests with central governance, and to maintain institutional memory across leadership transitions, created forms of political authority that outlasted individual rulers and survived considerable external pressure. The process was never simple or frictionless. Administrative systems required constant maintenance. The tension between centralization and local autonomy had to be managed continuously. Revenue extraction could undermine the agricultural productivity it depended on if pushed too far. Elites given resource rights in exchange for loyalty could eventually use those resources to challenge the authority that granted them. These structural tensions were built into the very arrangement that made resource-based authority possible. Yet despite these tensions and contradictions, the pattern holds across time and geography. Where rulers organized productive resources within durable institutional frameworks, political authority accumulated and persisted. Where that organizational capacity was absent or eroded, authority remained fragile regardless of military strength or legal claim. The institution of resource management was the quiet foundation beneath the more visible structures of governance. Political authority endures where resources are structured, not merely claimed.